Good morning, everybody. I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School. Thank you for joining us for today's Business Over Breakfast conversation. We have a new face and a slightly different topic today, which is about understanding unconscious bias to reduce prejudice in the workplace. Recent acts of violence have brought discussions of racism and social injustices to the fore, including at Goizueta Business School, where we've been exploring in depth the questions of race and equity to help inform how we think about the role and responsibilities of leaders, including ourselves, and organizations in social justice issues. Although this awareness helps employees check their biases on the conscious level, much of racial bias begins at an implicit level. And so this morning, Goizueta Business School professor Erika is going to discuss this unconscious psychological antecedents of the recent interactions between police and Black women and men. Although she will discuss these biases in the context of police interactions, these biases are held by society more broadly and have tremendous implications for reducing prejudice in the workplace. This is not an easy topic, but it is a critical one, and we're in good hands with Professor Erika Hall, one of our organization and management faculty, whose research focuses on the influence of race, gender, and class-based biases on interactions within the workplace and the broader society. In addition, she's looked at how leaders with multiple minority identities are perceived in terms of organizations and teams. This work and her teaching has been publicly recognized, and she was honored as one of the world's best 40 under 40 business professors by Poets and Quants in 2016. Erika is going to kick off the webinar with some thoughts and observations about implicit unconscious bias and how this plays out in the workplace, followed by Q&A. So please write your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and the team will do their best to get those answered to you today. At the end of today's session, there will be a short survey, so we appreciate you filling that in. And I know you'll find this session informative, and I look forward to continuing our conversations every Thursday morning. Thank you, and thank you, Erika.
Absolutely. Good morning. I'm excited to be here. My name is Erika Hall, and I'm an assistant professor in organization and management in the business school. And today I'm going to focus on unconscious biases that Blacks confront so that we can gain a little more insight into the implicit, unconscious aspects of the mind that drive disadvantage. And I'll start by telling you a little bit more about myself. So I'm an assistant professor at Goizueta Business School, but you'll find that much of my research uses context outside of the organization, so such as media, recreation, marriage institutions, and literature. I strongly believe that organizations are nested within society, so to understand organizational dynamics, you have to first understand the biases within larger society. I studied at the Kellogg School of Management, where I learned from both psychologists and sociologists about how the organization situates itself with societal context. And lastly, I investigate race and how it interacts with gender and class. Now today I'm going to detail a few implicit biases. Black Americans confront bias in two different spheres, personal and professional. And what is interesting about the past few months is that when the recent unarmed killings of Black men unfolded over the last few weeks, many Black employees felt a blend between their personal and professional spheres, such that the events were so hurtful, emotional, and evocative that it was almost impossible to concentrate on work at work without acknowledging this complete other side of their identity. A few years ago, I had the pleasure of conducting an interview project with Black and Latino alum of Goizueta Business School. And I remember how striking this quote was because I've heard it so often before. A Black male graduate in a high status healthcare role relayed his attempts to suppress the emotion he felt after Tamir Rice's death at work. So he said, after I want to say Tamir Rice got shot, I remember the girl saying, "I wish we could call into work for being Black." It was something that it felt personal. You know what I mean? At work, I couldn't let that show. If I'm sitting there sad and whatnot, they wouldn't understand why. You have to put on a face. You have to get through the day. You can't let any of that stuff bother you at work. You have to just go in and do your job. I definitely think Black culture is kept out of work for advancement or for things to be okay. And it would be one thing if this suppression was a one-time event. However, these instances are not few and far between, they are frequent. So this is a graphic from a paper I published in 2016. And unfortunately, as you know, there have been more faces to add to the list. Just a few in '99, it was Amadou Diallo, who was shot by the police. In Oakland, Oscar Grant in 2009, Trayvon Martin in 2012, and Mike Brown in 2014. I think we can all attest that there's been a certain zeitgeist over race or an increased attention to it in the past few months. And many Black employees are now seeing it as a relief that these persistent occurrences can be more openly discussed within the workplace, because there's an acknowledgement that these biases, these fears, are as much a part of Black's daily life as their professional identity. So as we take a deeper dive into the biases that Blacks confront in the workplace, I would be completely remiss to not give you both sides of the coin. That is, given that personal and professional blend so much, to understand the plight of Black Americans, you have to understand the biases that they confront both in and out of the workplace. So under personal, we will concentrate on the biases that exacerbate tensions between the police and Black Americans. And under professional, we will detail the biases that impede hiring and advancement in the workplace. I also have to note that this list is not exhaustive, it's not exclusive, but given that I only had an hour to share with you all, I wanted to give you a detailed sampling. One thing about my discussion of these biases that you should note is that I'm an experimentalist by training, and doing an experiment is limiting in some ways because it's devoid of history and context. However, it is advantageous in that it helps establish causation. So what do I mean by this? Well, there are scenarios that people confront when they're trying to determine whether something is racist. And in a lot of instances, these scenarios can be written off as anomalies. Well, that kid was just playing with a toy gun, or that employee's reviews were just so bad. In my field of analysis, we conduct experiments where we randomly assign people to one of two groups. In one of the groups, race is a factor. For example, we'll have them view a resume where a racial cue is present. In the other group, the racial cue is not present, but no other differences exist between the two resumes that each group viewed. Otherwise, they're identical. So then we can isolate race as the cause of someone's disadvantage so that there's no more room for debate. So I'll discuss several experiments with you that illustrate these biases. And I want to start my discussion by discussing an article that Brittany Cooper wrote a few years back covering some of my research. So Brittany Cooper is a prolific professor and writer of the New York best-selling book, Eloquent Rage. And while my writing is academic, hers is intensely eloquent, so I appreciated her take on my words. Essentially, the article delves into all the coded attributions that go into Blackness. The title was provocative. It's the Blackness that scares us. Blackness is so encoded with all of these things that are dark and scary and threatening that others feel that they need to alleviate or disarm that threat. The work that she covered was a study I did about the word Black as compared to another word we can use, African American. So it's interesting, the impetus for This particular research project was my experience at dinner parties. So I'd be at these dinner parties and I'd be speaking to a white colleague and I'd explain myself as a Black woman. And in response, in the conversation, they'd refer to me as an African American woman. Now, when this kept happening, it was so interesting to me because it was almost as odd to me as if I had introduced myself as Erika and somebody returned by responding to me as Jack. So this fueled my interest in knowing the undercoded meanings of Blackness. Is there anything encoded in the word Black that starts to evoke these visceral and even fearful responses? So I compared the content of the word Black with African American to see if these undertones pervaded the word. So I went to where all vigorous scientific research starts, which is the Google search bar. And I decided to look up the phrase Black people and then next the phrase African American people. And I want to give you a trigger warning for very offensive content, but I am into revealing the reality of what is readily accessible to people. So this is a snapshot of the Google image results when I typed in the phrase Black people. I'll just give you a second to sit with that. And then next, I went into the Google image search bar and I typed in the phrase African American people. This is what I got. So I was beginning to see a trend in this idea of Blackness being inherently coded with negative ideals. I performed a content analysis where I asked one group of people to assign traits that were associated to Blacks or with Blacks, another to evaluate whites, and a whole nother group to evaluate African Americans. Then I asked an entirely different group of people to evaluate the negative status, negativity status, warmth, and confidence of each of these words that were assigned. So I found that people who evaluated Blacks as a group chose more negative, lower status, less warm, and less confident terms than those that evaluated African Americans and whites. So I thought, what could the consequences of this be for the workplace? I gave participants identical resumes and either listed their race as Black or African American. Then I asked, what salary do you think this person should make? People who evaluated the Black candidate said, I think this person should make about $29,000 a year. People who evaluated the African American candidate said, I believe this person should make about $37,000. Then I asked whether they thought this person should be in a managerial position. 38% of the people who evaluated the Black candidate said, yes, definitely, they should be in a managerial position. For the African American candidate, 73% of people said, yes, I think they should be in a managerial position. Moving on, I looked in popular media and collected all news reports over a couple of decades that used the term Black or African American. I then used a program to systematically code the tone of the article. I found that those that used the term Black were more negative and less positive than those that used the term African American. And finally, I blasted one of those criminal notices to participants to tell you that a crime has occurred. So I don't know if you've ever seen this, but you'll get an email that says a Black suspect was going left on Lake Street after stealing such and such and so and so. And I either blasted a Black suspect was seen as going left on Lake Street, or an African American suspect was seen going left on Lake Street. And then I asked people how warm they felt toward the suspect. When the suspect was described as Black, people felt significantly less warm than when the suspect was described as African American. So it appeared that the very state of being Black and Blackness was encoded with a host of different stereotypes and biases. And as we try and attempt to understand the biases that Black employees face in and out of the workplace, the most top of mind right now are the stereotypes that place Blacks at a disadvantage with law enforcement. So we'll discuss biases related to Blacks as criminals, Black youth as adult-like, Blacks as both sub and superhuman, and shooter bias to begin. So the Blacks as criminal stereotype is pervasive at an implicit level. People may endorse the stereotype subconsciously and therefore still believe that they are unbiased. In one study, they subliminally primed participants by showing them flashes of either a Black or white man at such a speed that your subconscious mind would register the photo, but no participant could consciously dictate what they had seen. Then they showed them disguised photos of crime-related items that became clearer as time went on. So the participant's job was to immediately inform the experimenter when they recognized the item, okay? The results showed that when they were subliminally primed with a Black face, that they were much quicker to recognize the disguised photo as a gun than when they were primed with the white face. Cognitively, these connections in our brain make the thought of criminality more accessible when we see a Black face. More research has been conducted to experimentally test whether race influences weapon identification. This computer task briefly presented either a Black or white male face as a prime, followed by a target object, which was either a gun or a tool. So participants were asked to classify that object, and they found they had very little time to respond. So we always give them a cap on the time to respond. And the researchers found that participants identified guns more quickly and more accurately after they had been primed with a Black face rather than a white face. At the same time, participants identified tools more quickly and more accurately after they had been primed with a white face rather than a Black face. These findings suggest that the Black prime enhanced the tendency to respond as if a threat were present, implying an association between Blacks and threat. So in the most realistic of these tasks, which you see at the bottom, participants have to make shoot, no shoot decisions, which is that they see a Black or white person with a cell phone or a weapon, and they have to figure out whether to choose to shoot or not shoot the person, dependent on what they're holding and whether it's a threat. I'll give you a short example of a real life simulation of these shoot, don't shoot decisions.
Sir, drop that jacket right now!
During a chaotic situation
Cover me!
or an arrest, police officers have to be ready for anything and be able to react.
Imagine the most stressful day you've ever had in your life and multiply it by about 1 million.
It is a life or death situation Todd Brown knows well. He's vice president of TI training in Golden.
Freeze, police, don't move!
It develops shoot or don't shoot simulators used by police departments across the country.
So when you press a trigger, it's going to recoil like a real gun.
To see what officers go through every day, Brown put me through 2 simulations.
Let me see your ID.
The first, interviewing a man who looks like someone who's wanted for questioning. His uneasy nature enough to make me want to draw my weapon.
Every time a police officer makes contact with somebody, they don't know that person, okay? So everything they do is try to err on the side of safety.
Now I'm responding to a warehouse break-in. In the dark, I encounter a man after hearing someone call for help.
Show me both of your hands.
I fire after the man suddenly pulls out what I think is a gun. Turns out it was only a staple gun.
That's just a small example of a compressed time frame, adverse lighting condition, where you had to make that split-second decision.
I work here!
Now look at the same simulation, only this time the man does have a gun. How would you react?
No room for lack of vigilance, and certainly these guys display it on a daily basis.
Now, what the research finds is that participants tend to shoot unarmed Black men more so than unarmed white men. So they erroneously make the mistake of shooting unarmed Black men more than unarmed white men. Further, they shoot an armed target more quickly if he's Black rather than white, but decide not to shoot an unarmed target, so pressing the don't shoot key, more quickly if he's white rather than Black. I won't delve too much into exciting statistics. Ask me on a Friday. But signal detection analysis provides a useful lens for interpreting these errors. Essentially, it says that the criterion for shooting Black men is more lenient than it is for white men, which means in my decision to decide to shoot, I'll be more sensitive to determining whether any given suspect is armed versus not armed for white men, and less careful about delineating the same for Black men. And researchers have collected data in various populations to see whether the overall tendency was to shoot versus not shoot in these simulation games. One that we're particularly interested in the business school, as I teach both undergraduates and graduate populations, are novice undergraduates. So novice undergraduates are undergraduates who this is their first time doing the simulation. You see, overwhelmingly, more of a tendency to shoot Black suspects, which is this black bar going to the left, than white suspects. And the interesting thing is that it seems pretty consistent, but differs between a few populations. So one of the ones that you might be curious about are police officers versus special unit officers. So this is an interesting thing with the police officers that they sampled. You'll see the police officers have the reverse tendencies. And the group of police officers that they sampled had diverse tasks. So they responded to the elderly as well as to crime. So their associations aren't as connected with Black equaling violence or a threat. However, special unit officers only see intense gangs in very specific Black areas of high poverty. So their connection between Blacks and criminality was more intense, and that's evidenced in the tendency to shoot Blacks versus whites. Okay, so moving on to the other bias that aggravates this tension between the police and Black men and women. The Blacks as subhuman stereotype is also very pernicious and prevalent. A study documenting this used the same experimental paradigm and showed that people who were subliminally primed with a photo of a Black man versus a white man were quicker to decipher a fuzzy photo of an ape, suggesting that Blackness cognitively makes a stereotype of being ape-like more salient and accessible. In this really important work, co-authored by my Emory colleague, Professor Melissa Williams, you'll see that people were quicker to identify the ape image after they had been subliminally primed with a Black face rather than a white face. That is, they saw or recognized the image of an ape in fewer frames. Now relating this to a more material outcome, the authors had participants view a video of a Black or white man being beat by the police. They found that the degree to which people associated Blacks with apes increased the degree to which they would say that the beating was justified. So again, the racial difference led to an association of apes with Blacks, but not whites, which led to people justifying police brutality. Even more interestingly, Blacks simultaneously hold a stereotype as being superhuman, like a superhero. In the killing of Michael Brown, Officer Darren Wilson suggested in an ABC interview that the interaction with Michael Brown was like one with Hulk Hogan. So he says, and when I grabbed him, the only way I can describe it is I felt like a 5-year-old holding on to Hulk Hogan. Holding on to what? The interviewer says. Hulk Hogan. That's just how big he felt and how small I felt just from grasping his arm. Now, the studies that look into the association between Blacks and the superhuman stereotype use implicit association tests, or IATs. An IAT measures how quickly an individual associates two concepts. It's a tool that is widely used in unconscious bias or diversity training, So you may be well aware of it if you've encountered or taken any one of these trainings. Let's take a look at a video to see exactly how it works.
When the test first begins, you will be shown two of the categories, in this case, African American and European American, and you'll be asked to pair items into their correct category just to make sure you know which items belong in which category. So to put something in the left category, you press the E button, and to put something in the right category, you press the I button. So this would be I, this would be E, I, E, and so on and so forth. Now you're shown the next set of categories and you're matching words into them just like you did in the last set. Now two categories are paired, in this case African American and good. And this is the most important part of the test because the implicit association test measures your associations based on how quickly you respond. So if you respond more quickly when African American and good are paired rather than when African American and bad are paired, that means you have an implicit preference for African American. You may have noticed that once I place an item into its correct category, the next item appears. But if I place an item in the incorrect category, a red X will appear, such as here, and it will remain there until I place it in the correct category. The pairings have now been switched so that African American is paired with bad and European American is paired with good. This is to test how quickly you respond to this opposite pairing as opposed to the initial pairing.
Okay. Now with that primer, and I know it's a little bit complex to kind of wrap your head around it, what they found for this particular study was an overall association between Blacks and superhuman abilities rather than Blacks and human abilities because they categorize these elements quicker. A little bit more tangible, in a follow-up, participants were asked which of these people would be more capable of 3 superhuman qualities? And which do you think requires more pain medication to reduce the pain that they experience? The authors found that Blacks versus whites were rated as having more supernatural ability, and this belief of superhuman strength was also linked to the belief that they had an increased threshold for pain. So in interactions that we see with brutality, if there's a fear or a threat on one side about a Black person, they feel like they have to use extra strength to quell that threat because of this perceived supernatural ability. Finally, and the last bias we'll talk about before going to professional stereotypes is Blacks as adult-like. In this research, police officers evaluated the age and culpability of a set of Black and white child suspects. So the researchers also had data on the officers' records and their past histories of excessive force. They found that cops, or the cops in the sample, overestimated Black child suspects' age more so than they did white or Latino children. So if a Black child was shown and was 12 years old, they'd estimate that child to be 14 or 16. Further, they found that Blacks were more culpable of a crime than were white children. Importantly, they statistically show that Black children were perceived to be much older than white children, even if they were the same age, which increased the perceived culpability for the crime, meaning that if a Black child was perceived to be 18, they thought that they were more culpable of that crime. And this then predicted the degree to which the officer had a past history of excessive force toward Black suspects. So the degree to which the officer actually had a history of police brutality toward Black suspects. So I appreciate you letting me diverge into societal biases between Blacks and the police, because I truly feel like for Black employees, the weight of the burden of these biases does not stop when they get to professional atmospheres. The biases just differ, but the emotional toll is the same. Just as a short anecdote, I once posted a question on Facebook of when was the first time you were called the N-word and the first time a police officer held a gun to your face. In my reply, my answers are 24 and 22. And a fellow Black Emory colleague of mine replied ages 30 and 90. Ages 30 and 9. I don't want to out him because I didn't explain that I was going to tell this story, but he's a prominent staff member here at Emory. So while the instances between police and Blacks may seem otherworldly, it's very much a part and a scare of a Black employee's life. So we're going to turn to 3 or 4 biases that are prevalent in the workplace. And before I delve into more corporate environments, I want to slowly transition into another environment, the environment of professional sports. So management researchers readily use sports data for testing organizational effects because first, sports leagues are organizations with employees. Second, employees' performance and race information is readily available to the public. You can access that on the internet. And 3, you can see the penalties that are levied on individual sports employees in the public. So in 2012, I published a paper on the idea of hubris or cockiness. In both sports and the management world, a little cockiness typically benefits white men well, or at least isn't punished that severely. So in order to see how this behavior is perceived for Black men, we use professional football as our context. At the time, football players were penalized for excessively celebrating after touchdowns. It was characterized as unsportsmanlike conduct. Nonetheless, whether celebration is excessive is a subjective notion. We first measured the proportion of unsportsmanlike conduct penalties called on teammates of each racial group and found that 92% of penalties were levied on Blacks, where only 8% were levied on white teammates. So to do a controlled study that controls for and accounts for actual excessive celebration behavior, we ran an experiment where people evaluated a Black or white player for excessively celebrating after a touchdown. We found that people were significantly more likely to penalize the Black player and dock his pay than the white player who behaved identically. The workplace implication of this is that when pride and confidence in one's work is important for displaying leadership, these traits aren't valued for Black men, but are considered instrumental for white men. A great study that came out in 2016 shows the barriers that Blacks confront in the early hiring stages and looked at the practice of whitening a resume. So the researchers crafted hundreds of resumes that were identical, except for some included the full name of the Black candidate, as you can see, Lamar J. Smith, and some abbreviated that name with a first initial and a full middle name, and this was the whitening condition. Similarly, the person either indicated that the experience that he had as a member of a Black organization, he indicated that he was part of the Aspiring African American Business Leaders Association, or an organization that had no racial affiliation, so the Aspiring Business Leaders Association. Then the authors sent these fictitious surveys out to over 1,000 actual employers and measured the number of callbacks that each type of resume received. So while the whitened resume received callbacks 25% of the time, the unwhitened resume received callbacks only 10% of the time. If you look to the graph, figure 1, the gray bars are measuring the callbacks that were received for jobs that had pro-diversity language, showing that even jobs who purported to value diversity still dismissed the Blackness of a job candidate. Okay, Blacks as low in competence. An implicit bias exists of Blacks as lower in competence A fairly recent study analyzed presidential campaign speeches over the years to white versus Black audiences, and it measured the number of intellectual words that were used. So in an effect called the competence downshift, it showed that whites diluted the intellectual content of their speeches for Black audiences, owing to the fact that there is an implicit assumption that these audiences are less competent than all white audiences. Again, they followed this up with experiments with one-on-one interactions with Black versus white interaction partners, and found that the whites in their sample shifted their language away from big intellectual words when interacting with a Black versus white partner. And interestingly enough, that this effect was most prevalent among white liberals. The sad workplace implication here is that if there is an implicit belief that Blacks are less competent, Black employees won't be challenged in ways that inspire growth and that prepare them for promotion. And in a study that my colleagues and I published last year, we looked at compensation data from a large retail organization in the United States that had about 25,000 employees, over 750 stores. Because of a confidentiality agreement, I'm not at liberty to share the name of that organization, but you would know the name. We looked at how diverse versus non-diverse teams were compensated based on performance. We found that bias in compensation is exacerbated for low-performing rather than high-performing teams. What does this mean? So this means that between teams that were diverse and not diverse, when the teams performed well in terms of sales, there was no plausible explanation for giving them a lower salary. Nonetheless, if you compare teams with an equal level of lower performance in terms of sales, you start to see the bias emerge. Teams that have greater representation of Black employees were compensated less than teams that had less representation of Black employees. Now, you'll have to excuse me for embarrassing my students who helped me create this stimuli for a follow-up experiment. When we did an experiment with these photos, we replicated the effects. So we found that people downgraded the pay for the low-performing, diverse, but not all white teams, because they believed that negative stereotypes associated with Blackness, such as incompetent, laziness, was the explanation for the poor performance of the diverse team, and circumstances like the economy were the explanation for the poor performance of the all-white team. Now, researchers are very good at documenting bias because that's honestly the easiest feat. However, they are less good at developing the policies that will work to eradicate the bias. As a takeaway, I can tell you from a science perspective what works. Counter-imaging. So if we refer back to the shooter bias study with different subpopulations, we'll remember that police officers that also did mundane tasks, such as helping the elderly, had less bias than those that were in special units, where they only worked gang crime in minority neighborhoods. This is because the former police force engaged in activities that were counter-stereotypical. The presence of imagery on organizations' websites, the diversity of speakers that are invited to present workshops, and the representation of Blacks in areas that run counter to the stereotype mentally alter our cultural associations and our behaviors. Moving on to deliberation. Implicit biases can be overcome. However, it takes careful deliberation to turn them off. Most of the studies we see with implicit biases have quick time decisions because people's automatic processing produces the most biased results. We find that when people logically deliberate with more thoughtful type 2 systems, we call them, bias is mitigated. So in the workplace, this means designing processes that mandate thoughtful and systematic deliberations rather than gut decisions. even on something as simple as a first pass at a resume. Hiring for values. Another thing that is known to mitigate the effect of implicit biases is egalitarianism, or a value system that promotes diversity and equality for all. Organizations can create greater emphasis on hiring people whose values match those they want to imbue. So even though egalitarians may espouse the same biased associations, because these are just cultural implicit associations we hold in our mind, we find that their value systems stop them from enacting any detrimental behaviors because of the cultural associations that they hold. Large-scale cultural shifts. So this summer, we experienced a large-scale cultural shift whereby it was normative, or more normative, to discuss and promote racial equality. This changes how people respond to diversity training and how they respond to the overall stereotype in Blackness. In my recent research, I find that people are now more likely to donate to a Black versus African American organization because the former, Blackness, reminds them more of the disadvantage in the stereotype. So effects change as people's acknowledgement of racial bias changes. Words are also so important. So we should be conscious of how words are used or not used that perpetuate bias. This brings us back to the incompetent study, right? The competence downshift when talking to Blacks. We should challenge managers to document how they challenge their team members, both white and Black in other races, and gave them opportunities to stretch and grow. We need to create accountability and a paper trail of why somebody was rejected, and make sure that the criterion by which they are evaluated does not change across the candidates. So we can see that in my study that I did with the different team members, diverse and non-diverse, and the explanation for the poor performance of the diverse team was ideals like this person was incompetent or this person was lazy, evoking Black stereotypes, whereas the explanation for the white team was that it had something to do with the economy or things just weren't working out for them. So we want to compare those explanations of why people aren't advancing to the next round and make sure that they don't change across candidates. Implicit biases are natural. However, how we choose to act on them is completely up to us. Now that you're aware of some of these biases, you can consciously deliberate on how to disrupt them. I want to say that I appreciate you logging in this morning to attack a difficult problem. It's not easy to talk about race. It's not easy to talk about privilege or disadvantage. But one thing that we know is that it is necessary. Thank you for listening to this presentation, and I invite any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Erika. This was extremely helpful content and a lot of great feedback in the Q&A section and in chat. The first question comes in from an African-American woman who felt a responsibility to engage coworkers in healthy conversations about what was currently going on in regards to systemic racism.
Sure.
And she notes that what was personally disappointing for her was that the African-American leaders in work positions of influence remained silent and acted as if nothing was occurring. So her question is, how do you professionally encourage leadership, especially those who are African-American, to demonstrate emotional intelligence and engage in uncomfortable conversations?
Okay, you faded out two particular points, but I think that I got the gist of your question. And it's a tricky question, right? Because at the beginning of the talk, I was talking about this separation that Black Americans have between personal and professional. Because typically throughout history, we've seen that these personal aspects of the Black identity weren't really embraced within organizational environments. So what you see is a residue of that where Black Americans are reticent to kind of engage in conversations of race or advance questions of inequity because they're worried about the backlash that could come from them doing so. And this is a real thing because the backlash also exists. One thing that I found in my data, my qualitative data of interviewing people, is that as they advance in leadership roles, they can feel that they're more authentic. So we do see that more senior managers feel like they have kind of the right and enough authority within the organization that they can engage other Black Americans or talk about racial inequality. So one thing is to pull on the senior leadership teams, if they exist, of Black Americans at the top. The other thing actually is, I'm going to switch the onus to the non-Black employees within the organization. The organization needs to create a culture where it promotes this idea of sharing and says that is okay. Because a lot of things that happen are microaggressions or slights that suggest that, oh, you're talking about race again? Okay. And when we get kind of that feedback, then we don't want to embrace racial inequality or talk about racial equality, because we too want to feed our families in advance. So part of what the organization can do is be more intentional of saying that, no, your opinions about bias or racial inequality are valued here. And we're going to put our money where our mouth is and show you that we're valued, because as part of advancing you or promoting you or growing you as an employee, we want you to bring that stuff to our table and inform us of what we can do to challenge the status quo.
Thank you. Hopefully my audio is a little better.
Yeah.
This next question asks, when studies like you mentioned are referenced, is the respondent group balanced in their race and sex, or is there a difference in how men or women or different races respond?
It's a great question, because there is a glaring omission in the work that I presented here today. Most of it you'll see is skewed toward Black men. But as a scholar of what's called intersectionality, which is the study of how race and gender and class interact, we see that there are differences between how people perceive Black women versus Black men. So in the particular studies that I showed today, they either apply both to Black women or Black men, or apply solely to Black men. The thing more was a time constraint. I felt like I had to do an overview of the biases within the 45-minute slot, but I'd be happy to chat offline or give some information about intersectionality and how Black women or people of different class groups are also differently affected by some of these things.
Thank you. Shifting gears to something that you mentioned in terms of superhuman traits. Recent studies have indicated that Black people are suffering during medical procedures
Yes.
because of the perceived superhuman traits. Do you have more in-depth research or studies regarding this? And does this relate to the higher mortality rate for Black women in childbirth?
Absolutely. A good friend of mine just posted on Facebook, she was looking at a textbook where they described cultural associations of patients. And one of the associations for Black patients was that they might have a higher tolerance for pain, right? Which is not true. But the fact that a textbook that was presented in recent times would say something like this is definitely problematic. Another place that we see this, and I'm particularly cognizant of this in being pregnant right now, is with maternal mortality. We see that Black women who express that they're having pain or they're having issues are being dismissed in that people think that they can tolerate the pain a little bit more. So it's definitely an issue in the medical community. I think that they're aware of that from the discussions that I've had with people over at the med school or personally even my own doctors. But the idea of Black people being able to withstand more pain relates to either them not getting the health care that they deserve, and we see those disparities, or for them to tolerate more brutality or greater harm when other people feel threatened by their presence.
Very interesting. This next question asks, is there a difference, is there any difference in Black police bias and white police bias versus Black criminals?
Yes and no. So this is a little bit tricky. They've done studies with both Black police and white police, and they find that even though the stereotype is slightly abated, you still see that preference for tending to not shoot unarmed white males, but to shoot unarmed Black males. Most of these things that deal with implicit bias deal with cultural associations. Cultural associations are affected by the things that we see in society as we're growing up. One big one is the media. The degree to which a Black, white, whatever person sees a connection between Blacks and criminality, they're going to hold that cultural stereotype in their head, regardless of their race. So they do find in participant samples that you do see the same bias, although not to the same degree within police, Black police officers.
Thank you. And a couple of questions reference this point. How can organizations go beyond having discussions on race in the workplace to actually making intentional, positive, and strategic changes to its policies and practices that will promote advancement of Blacks in the workplace and continue conversations beyond 2020?
Yeah, this is so tricky, and I feel like it's going to be the greatest letdown in my response, because honestly, we're on the research side, we're still working on that, right? So as I said, we're really good at documenting kind of this disadvantage and what happens on a smaller scale, but we need more partnerships with organizations to test out whether policies actually work. Okay, so there are some researchers that do look into policies and their effectiveness, but the research is generally newer. So we haven't seen or can completely validate it. We do know that there are some policies like transparency and compensation that help with both gender and race. We do find that ARGs or ERGs are particularly helpful in making Blacks feel that they belong in the organization, but there are other aspects that haven't been tested and will have to be a first mover thing. So for example, I was in a CHRO round group and people were talking about, or the chief HR officers were talking about succession plans, and that in a succession plan, we need to detail who are the people that are coming up next for these high level positions, and is there enough of a mix of people from different ethnic or racial backgrounds that are on that level that are able to move into this leadership position when it is vacated, right? So succession plans are something that haven't been studied empirically, but it does take one organization trying to do something new to figure out what actually works. And so I apologize in advance for it being a subpar answer, but I just want to be real with the state of where research is and where we have to go.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you. And Dr. Hall, I think we have time for one more question. And this last question is from an alum. What can alumni of color do to be supportive of students, faculty, and staff of color that are experiencing racial injustices on campus?
Yeah. So one thing that I found exceptional about this recent area or the zeitgeist that we're in is there are Instagram chains that are Blacks at Emory or Blacks at whatever organization. You see this even with middle schools, high schools, and you see it with colleges too. And in that, you see Black alumni sharing their experience about disadvantage that they experienced while they were at that organization or they were at that particular school. I think the solidarity and knowing that somebody else went through it with you is definitely helpful, right? To forge those connections with alumni through maybe mentorship programs that can be a little bit more intentional. Say, look, I went through this. This is how, through my 4 years here, I adjusted, or MBA, through my 2 years here, I adjusted. This is how I maneuvered, and this is what worked well for me. I think is an amazing bridge that could help both our undergraduate and graduate students.
Thank you so much, Erica. We really appreciate you jumping on board and joining the Business Over Breakfast webinar series.
Sure.
And we want to thank you all, our attendees, for joining us and coming back each and every Thursday for this and all of your comments and questions that were asked today.